the dangerous freedom of being alone. Nietzsche, what if the door to your freedom opens only when everyone else has already walked away? Imagine you've climbed so far beyond the city that its sounds are no longer sounds, only the suggestion of a hum below. The air is thin, the light is honest, and in that clarity, a voice that is not a voice says, "No one is coming to save you." Some people hear that and run back. Others exhale and keep walking. Friedrich Nietzsche chose to keep walking. He did it with a body that betrayed him, eyes that flickered and failed, nights filled with migraines that felt like hammers in the skull. He did it with a reputation bleeding from misunderstandings, and with the endless temptation to be ordinary pressing him to return to the herd. Instead, he hunted an impossible discipline, to become singular, to become himself, to become a person who could bear the weight of freedom without anyone's hands beneath him. Solitude is a dangerous freedom. It strips away the soothing soundtrack of agreement. It cuts the soft ropes tethering you to your tribe. It is not romance in a cabin. It is not the aesthetically pleasing isolation of a weekend retreat. It is the raw experiment of living without borrowed convictions, the long apprenticeship in standing alone in thought, and the risk that without a crowd to mirror you, you will lose your face. Nietzsche, a man trained to be a pastor in childhood and to be a professor in youth, discovered that sometimes the greatest act of thought is a severing. The world first met him as a prodigy. At 24, a professor of classical philology in Basel, composing dense, brilliant essays on Greek tragedy and lyric poets. He wore a stiff collar and tried to be a gentleman of letters, but the mountains were already calling the stranger inside him. He tried to be the dutiful son of German culture, and then he tried to be the dutiful son of Richard Wagner, who embodied German art itself. Both obediences would crack. Both cracks would cost him almost everything. When the dust settled, Nietzsche was not safe. He was free. He understood early that thinking is not tidy or polite. It is a storm. He served as a medic in a war that left him vomiting with dysentery and disgusted by nationalism. He fell in love with music and myth, and then fell out of love with the men who claimed them for glory. He fled from Basel because the desk was killing him. He gave up a career people would have killed for, returning his salary because he refused to be kept alive by a title that felt like a cage. "I write only with my feet," he said, and wandered on foot for hours each day in the thin air of the Alps, as if to say that thought must pass through the body, become breath, sweat, frost on the mustache. But the freeing wind of solitude can become an ice storm, and Nietzsche kept stepping into it. An age that was massing people into factories and nations thought he was indecently alone. He did not marry. He could not belong. He rented cheap rooms in small towns by the sea and in the mountains, carrying a few books and a few shirts, moving when he felt watched or adored or pitied. He learned silence. Then he learned the hard laughter of someone who knows silence. His books sounded like thin blades, not systems but aphorisms and parables, flashes of clarity that ripped the curtain and then vanished. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote, as if to justify the noise in his head. But he was also a moral psychologist of frightening gentleness, examining pride and shame the way a skilled thief touches a lock, feeling for the tumblers. He understood humiliation well enough to turn it into theory, and loneliness well enough to turn it into a creed. And yet people rarely keep company with a creed that asks them to be alone. Nietzsche kept asking, not the safe alone of the ego, sealed in its bunker of certainty, but the dangerous alone of the explorer who abandons the coastline. Be careful, he suggested, because when you fight monsters, you learn how to mimic them. Be careful, because when you stare into the abyss, it does not remain an object. It becomes a mirror. But also, do not be too careful. Those who love safety grow brittle. Those who refuse the desert never learn to see. What did he expect to find in the desert of solitude? not truths that looked like commandments, and not comfort. He was chasing the kind of clarity that allows a person to choose their life instead of living it on loan. He believed in a freedom that is frightening because it asks, what if you had to justify your existence to yourself without reciting what you were given, and without the applause of a tribe? What if you had to become the author? Nietzsche suspected that this is the hardest human task, not the conquest of nations, not the accumulation of wealth, but the conquest of excuses, the refusal to let resentment author your life, the disobedience to the false sweetness of victimhood, the creation of a singular taste. The more he thought, the more he had to leave. He left the church when it tried to make him into a son. He left the university when it tried to make him into a clerk. He left Wagner when the myth became a stadium. He left friends when they became his audience. He even tried to leave himself, burning through old styles, old names. After a while, there was no place to return. This is where the danger glows brightest. Alone, you can starve on meaning. Alone, you can crown yourself king of a kingdom that is only an empty room. Alone, you can hallucinate. Nietzsche knew this. At night, his migraines felt like punishments from a god he had declared dead. His letters wavered between tenderness and delirium. And yet, in the morning, he would lace his boots, step onto a path carved by water and time, and walk into the light sharp as a blade, as if to prove that thinking requires weather. There is an image that follows him. A thin man on a balcony in Sils Maria, watching the lake with the patience of a saint who has renounced prayer. He stands very still, except for the pencil in his hand. He smiles alone. He is writing a book that will be ignored. He is writing to a person who does not yet exist. He is writing for you. You may ask, what could draw a person to such isolation? The answer is not saintliness and not arrogance. It is a gamble that the price of thinking alone, of risking your sanity and reputation and place, is paid back with a form of freedom that cannot be counterfeited. Nietzsche was an addict of that wager. He staked health and love and career on it, and sometimes he lost. But sometimes, on a clear afternoon, he seemed to hold a coin that no one else could see. A mood of fierce cheerfulness in which life was not excuse or complaint, not wound or weapon, but possibility. He called the cheerfulness a philosophy with a dancer's step. He loved the thought that we might learn to say yes to everything that has been, not because it is good, but because it is ours. But first, to speak honestly, he had to teach himself to be alone enough to hear his own voice without the echo of the crowd. And then he had to learn how not to be destroyed by it. His apprenticeship in solitude began with love. Nietzsche fell in love early with the Greeks. Their tragedies where gods and mortals overstep and break. Their athletes who ran not to win, but to prove that excellence was a form of worship. Their philosophers who argued in markets and courtyards and died with a steady voice. He wrote his first book like a confession, a lament for a culture that has traded its deep music for cleverness. The birth of tragedy was many things: an homage to Wagner, a declaration of war on sober reason, a belief that art is not decoration but destiny. It was also a social suicide note in the academy. His colleagues saw the musician behind the philologist and dismissed him with a sigh. Nietzsche wrote himself into exile. He had a mentor now, a son that warmed him. Richard Wagner, the composer with the hypnotist's eyes. At Tribschen, Wagner's villa by the lake, Nietzsche found an intoxicating version of belonging. He believed Wagner's music could redeem modern man. That myth could be remade, that Germany could be great in a way that was spiritual and not merely loud. To be close to greatness is a kind of intoxication, and Nietzsche drank. He sat at the piano, trembling. He swallowed Wagner's sentences. He allowed the glamour to loosen his loneliness. But belonging, for Nietzsche, always demanded payment. Wagner led him to Bayreuth, where the myth went industrial. There were uniforms, flags, a festival for the nation. Nietzsche could feel the air thickening with the steam of mass emotion. The dangerous freedom of being alone now faced an older danger, the pleasant imprisonment of a cause. He felt himself becoming a priest to a music that was turning into a religion. He recoiled, and when he recoiled, the glamour adjusted its mask and called him ungrateful. This was his first great escape. It cost him his place in a circle that could have made him comfortable for life. It cost him friendships. It cost him the illusion that genius could be a sanctuary. He wrote a book called Human, All Too Human, to discipline his senses, like a man who pours cold water over his head after a fever dream. It was his book of sobriety, clear, skeptical, even punitive in its critique of metaphysics. He went to Sorrento with a small group and learned to distrust the bacchanal of inspiration. Every aphorism in that book sounds like a man running quietly from a house that is about to burn. His body tested him. Illness had been a tutor since childhood. A father dying early, head-splitting pain, poor digestion, eyes that rebelled after too much reading. He wrote on bad days from a couch, the window shuttered, the light like a blade he could not look at. On good days he walked until the world opened again, until the sentence clicked into place like the last stone in an arch. He learned to stoop slightly, to shield himself from gusts. He learned which foods would not betray him. He learned to travel with as little as possible. He became, in his own phrase, a man of few needs. There were episodes of yearning that humiliated him. In 1882, he met Lou Andrea Salome, brilliant, quick, ruthless in her intelligence. She did not want to belong to anyone. She wanted to study life like a living lab. Nietzsche proposed. Twice. She refused. The friendship exploded into a small scandal. He was left with a pain that made him feel adolescent and old at the same time. He turned the wound into ideas about women, as many men do when they are hurt. Some of his worst pages come from that ache, an ache he could not turn into insight without cutting others. Solitude was not making him better. It was making him honest, and honesty is not always kind. He resigned from Basel at 34, his body no longer consenting to the schedule of a professor. He became a nomad with a small income and a country's worth of boarding houses. He wintered along the Mediterranean, where his symptoms eased, and summered in the Engadine, in the crisp air that made his head clear. Nice, Genoa, Turin, Rapallo, names on envelopes, temporary belongings, a life measured out in rented rooms, teacups, salves, a few carefully folded letters. He had become a citizen of the edges. Nietzsche's solitude was not misanthropy. He admired a few humans fiercely, Stendhal's bright cruelty, Montaigne's frank conversation with himself, Spinoza's crystalline refusal to hate. He wrote letters with affection and humor. He craved an audience not of many, but of the few who might understand. A book for the very few, he once wrote, as if narrowing his readers were also an act of tenderness, a promise not to be devoured by the crowd. But you cannot be alone at this pitch without hearing something else whisper, "No one will remember you." Nietzsche battled obscurity like a sailor battling insomnia, pacing the deck in the dark. He reminded himself that the future is always a poorly lit room. He reminded himself to write as if someone would appear there someday looking for a flame. He also reminded himself that being alone too long curdles into hatred. He diagnosed the poison called resentment, the soul's slow tightening around its injuries, the re-rooted courage that turns attack into moral superiority, the way the weak learn to call themselves good. He loathed the way suffering sanctifies itself without examining its own complicity. He called this frame of mind a sickness, an economy of revenge where the currency was tears. To avoid poisoning himself with his own solitude, he demanded that his thinking remain dangerous to himself, that it unsettle his comfort. He refused the final certainties that would have given him a throne. He called himself a psychologist when he could have called himself a philosopher, a philologist, a prophet. He called himself an experiment. He tested his own motives, like a physician tapping a knee. He asked if his attack on morality hid his own wound. He asked if his praise of strength was a salve for weakness. He mistrusted his own eloquence, which was beautiful enough to persuade him of anything. Then he wrote the line that detonated in the modern mind like a clear bell at a funeral. God is dead. He did not mean it as a celebration. He meant it as a report, like a journalist covering a catastrophe. He described a madman carrying a lantern into the morning, asking where God had gone, and then seeing that the sky itself had torn, that an entire civilization had lost its sun. Without that light, how would we navigate? We had killed him with our needles of criticism, our acids of science, our new economies, and our quiet treaties with the absurd. But in the empty sky, the stars would not rearrange themselves to guide us. Alone before an indifferent cosmos, we would have to become our own astronomers. This is the suspense. Alone, with no omniscient judge watching, with no afterlife to pay the bills, with no absolute scale measuring the value of your acts, what will you do? Most people will find a new herd, a substitute dogma, a fresh set of words to cover their fear. Nietzsche wanted another response. A person willing to stand without anesthesia, to choose without the therapist in the sky, to replace obedience with invention. That person, he said, would not be a monster, though many would call them one. They would be more human. They would be dangerous because they could not be recruited, and they would be free. In Sils Maria, the air is the kind that deletes excuses. The lake is a mirror left on the table of a god who forgot it. Stones remember glaciers. Larches lean like tired archers who learned patience. Nietzsche rented a small room and walked a loop above the water. It was here, he said, that a thought visited him like a sudden animal you are not sure you should touch. He imagined a demon who comes when you are most alone, not when you are suffering dramatically, or when you are surrounded by friends, but in the quiet room of your everyday. The demon whispers, "This life, as you have lived it, and as you are living it, you will have to live again. Not once, not twice. Again and again, in every detail. Every blush, every misstep, every throat clearing, every headache, every book you read to avoid sleeping, every window you didn't open. There will be no new scenes. There will be no editing. Would you gnash your teeth and call the demon a devil? Or would you say, 'You are a god, and you have never given me a greater gift'? This is the thought of eternal recurrence, Nietzsche's strangest instrument. It is not a cosmology, not a physics. It is a psychological test that you take alone. If you cannot say yes to the life you are living, if the thought of its return horrifies you, then something fundamental is refusing to wake up. The test is cruel, because your first answer will likely be no. But then you have a question that is sharper than any moral. How must I live so that I could say yes? The demon's face becomes the face of responsibility, the way an enemy's eyes sometimes resemble those of a teacher. The experiment requires loneliness. You cannot outsource your answer. If you decide to change your life, it will not be because a law told you so, or because a priest threatened you. It will be because in the silence of your own room, with no witness, but a mischievous demon, you chose to affirm your life rather than curse it. Nietzsche believed this could be a turning point, equal to conversion, but aimed at the world rather than out of it. Instead of aiming to escape, you turn to face. You say yes not to an idea of life, but to its weather. The early rain, the late frost, the sudden hail that shreds your garden. From this thought, another grew. Love of fate. Amor, Fati. Not resignation. Not, it is what it is, but a gratitude so fierce it is indistinguishable from courage. Could a person bless their own past, unamended, and bless every necessity that pressed them into their current shape? Nietzsche wanted that. He wanted to walk through the day as if he had chosen it, as if he had personally signed off on every accident. This wasn't denial. It was the opposite, a refusal to keep negotiating with reality as if it were an enemy you hadn't fought to a draw. To choose this kind of affirmation, Nietzsche had to make a new style of mind. He practiced it as a craftsperson practices wood, by touching it daily, shaving off a sliver of falsehood, sanding a roughness of resentment, stepping back to see if the grain is visible. His books from this period are lighter on their feet, less mournful, surprisingly funny. He wrote the gay science not as a frivolity, but as the recognition that a cheerful mind is not a shallow mind. Sometimes it is a mind that has survived honesty. He wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, like a sermon delivered by a prophet who refuses a church, a book that reads like lightning, trying to describe itself while it strikes. Zarathustra is solitude turned into theater. A man leaves his cave, descends to share what he has learned, and is not believed. He speaks of the overman, the person beyond man, and of the rope stretched over an abyss between animal and creator. He speaks of the last man, whose blinking eyes crave comfort more than truth, who has forgotten how to despise his own timidity. The last man is what the herd produces when it triumphs, a creature who calls his littleness good and dies without having ever lived. To answer Zarathustra is to decide which man is gestating in you. The overman, often misunderstood, is not a blonde statue. He is a project, a person who metabolizes suffering into power, who refuses to call his fear morality, who learns to command his own instincts instead of letting them gossip themselves into shame. This is not the tyranny of others. It is the governance of one's own house. It cannot be taught by decree. It is brewed in solitude, where a person learns whether their strength is more than a pose. Nietzsche's solitude was filled with masks. Not masks to deceive, but masks to test. He wrote under personae. He laughed at himself by multiplying his selves. He called his thought a labyrinth and left Ariadne's thread dangling from his sentences. He attacked his heroes when he sensed himself kneeling. He warned that systems are forms of laziness, and that philosophers build concept palaces to hide the animal that trembles inside them. He turned the entire enterprise of philosophy into a question of physiology and taste. Who wrote this? With what body? After what meals? With what rancors? The truth became not a window, but a window with a face behind it, breathing on the glass. This is perspectivism, a word later friends would misuse as license for apathy. For Nietzsche, it meant, there is no view from nowhere. Every insight arrives from a place, with legs tired from certain paths, with eyes trained by particular lights. That doesn't make it false. It makes the work harder. We must learn how to bring our perspectives into tension without pretending to announce from heaven. The alone thinker has no chorus to sing for him. He must try out his lines in the cold and correct his tone. He cannot comfort himself with the mood of the group. He must earn the right to affirm, because he has the power to deny. Even his cruelty was a way of purifying. He called himself a hammer, but he was often a tuning fork. The idols he smashed were hollow precisely because they were easy to love. Goodness had turned into obedience, truth into repetition, humility into a weapon wielded by cowards. He knew where the ugliness hid because he had felt it in himself. The desire to wound from a noble couch, the temptation to call his ill health a deeper sensitivity. He called all these maneuvers human, all too human, not as condemnation, but as diagnosis. If being human is a disease, he wanted to be the doctor who would not lie about the prognosis. In the stillness of Sils Maria, the revelation became less a thought than a posture. His books turned sunward, full of noon metaphors. The great noon, when humanity must choose between backsliding into comfort and leaning forward into creation. The sun burns, it illuminates. It also signals the shortening of shadows. Alone, Nietzsche had trimmed his own. He returned to the same paths each day, not out of habit, but out of devotion, as if instructing his nervous system to stop mistaking change for danger. He remembered the Greeks not for their marble, but for their agon, the contest where excellence needs rivals to become more itself. He imagined a new version of that contest, where the rivals were not men but moods, pity and pride, truth and consolation, health and the glamour of sickness. This agone could only be fought within the solitary person, because the referee must also be the competitor. No judges, no medals, only the slow curve of one's taste becoming clean. Solitude had almost transformed from a lack into a strength. Almost. The knife still had a second edge. Nietzsche knew it. A hermit can become a cave. A free spirit can become a castle that no one enters. He tried to keep doors open by writing as if he were conversing, as if a stranger might sit across the table. He praised friendship as the discipline of distance, not fusion, not ownership, but the pleasure of two strong people meeting between their fortresses to exchange fruits they cannot grow alone. If love cannot be friendship at this pitch, he warned, it will rot into mutual diminishment. He wanted friends who would help him become more himself, not less. He wanted to be that for others too. There is tenderness in his harshest pages when you read them as the product of a man who is afraid of wasting his small life on the softness that makes no one better. The soft lie. The lie that tells you that your cowardice is compassion, that your boredom is peace, that your dependence is loyalty. He preferred cruelty that wakes you to a lie that tucks you in. Not because pain is holy, but because awakening may require a bracing wind, and only the solitary can stay in it long enough to understand what it will change. In 1888, Nietzsche wrote like a man trying to empty a burning house with his hands. The books came fast, lighter and sharper, his style with a knife's joy. Twilight of the Idols, the Wagner book that was a last letter and an exorcism. The Antichrist, a fury against the moralities that he believed, taught people to bow to their weakness and call it love. Ecce Homo, where he wrote the sentence that scared even his admirers. I am no man, I am dynamite. It was not a boast. It was a warning. If you carry this thinking into the city, it will explode your old zodes. Exhaustion masquerades as productivity before it collapses. Nietzsche was living alone in Turin, on a street where horses worked themselves to a quiet death and humans hurried. He composed lines that felt like a body ascending a spiral staircase, missing the banister, still climbing. He sent letters that read like proclamations and prayers. He was a precise thinker, growing imprecise about himself. You could say his solitude had become not a discipline, but an atmosphere, and oxygen was thinning. The image that haunts his afterlife arrived in this moment. Nietzsche sees a horse being beaten in a square. He runs to it, throws his arms around its neck, weeps, apologizes, breaks. We do not know if this happened precisely like the story says. We know he broke. The letters that followed were lucid in their desperation. He signed some Dionysus, some the crucified. He asked old friends for money and forgiveness. He praised enemies without irony. The mind that had been his instrument began playing him. A cart carried him away from the streets of Turin, where he had been alone in a crowd, back to a home he had left, his mother, and later his sister, in Naumburg. He never returned to the city under his own power. The last 11 years of his life unspooled in a fog almost no one could lift. He sat in a chair and watched, or not. He walked in circles in a garden. He ate pastries and played at being comfortable. He held his mother's hand. The greatest walker in modern thought lost his feet. As if to prove every warning he had written, the abyss gazed back. It did not blink. His sister, Elizabeth, a woman of will and a student of attention, managed his papers. She was not a philosopher. She was many other things. A believer in the ideology whose monstrous era was coming, a curator of her brother's image, a proprietor of a Nietzsche archive that turned the mess of his notes into a machine for causes he would have excoriated. She selected and pruned. She extracted a doctrine called will to power from notebooks he had treated as fields, not temples. She domesticated a wild thought to feed a politics that would, decades later, try to turn Europe into a tomb. Nietzsche's solitude had made him unownable. Posthumously, he was owned. It took a century of patient scholarship and stubborn readers to take his work back from the misreaders who loved his swagger and ignored his psychology, who loved his contempt and ignored his tenderness, who loved the noise of his hammer and ignored the listening behind it. He is still being recovered. He will always be. It is too simple to say he went mad because he was alone. Madness does not obey simple narratives. His body was a battlefield. Syphilis has been suggested, as has a congenital disease, as has the white heat of an overclocked brain. But there is a lesson, not medical, not punitive. The discipline of being alone must be learned with the same seriousness as a craft, and it has the same costs. You practice it too hard, too fast, without masters or apprentices, and the workshop catches fire. You refuse it, and you make copies of other people's lives with your own name on the cover. Either way, there is danger. The question is whether one danger is worthy. Nietzsche had asked for a cheerfulness that did not lie, a joy that did not require anesthesia. He called it a yes and amen song, a dance that requires a scar. The joy he sought did not arrive as happiness. It arrived as radiance in the midst of pain. "What does not kill me makes me stronger," he wrote, and then life obliged by asking if he meant it. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is, "It bent me into a shape that can carry different things." Sometimes the answer is, "It broke me not into pieces, but into quiet." Strength is plural. Nietzsche knew this in flashes. He could not embody every form. If you listen to his real tone, not the quotations ripped by motivational posters, or the sneers cut out by cynics, you hear a man working against the heaviness of resentment with the lightness of laughter. His laughter was not contempt. It was a technique for not drowning. He suspected that modern life would be a flood of information without wisdom, of togetherness without community, of work without pride. He would not have been surprised by our virtual herds, our infinite scrolls, our swarm of judgments. He would have understood the paradox of feeling more alone while more connected. He would have suggested a different alchemy. Take time alone not to wall yourself off, but to sharpen your eyes. Return to others not to demand, but to give. Build a discipline of cheerfulness, so your yes matters when you say it. We fear being alone because we imagine it reveals we are nothing. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the room is quiet because there is nothing in the room. But often we fear it because we know what would speak if we did not drown it with noise. The very voice that tells us which compromises have rotted, which loves are real, which work is ours to do. Nietzsche's dangerous freedom was to treat that voice as sovereign. He let it wreck what needed to end. He let it mislead him sometimes. He paid, but he refused the cheaper freedom, the freedom to choose a consumer good. He wanted the older freedom, the kind that writes your biography as a series of choices no one applauded at the time. He died in 1900 in Weimar, in a bed watched by the sane sister who misused him. On his gravestone, his name looks almost pastoral. Friedrich Nietzsche, son of a pastor, brother, a man from Racken. The dates make him look like a human who fit in a century. He did not. He slipped out of every category and then paid for it with a form of obscurity that hurt while he lived and a fame that hurts now with misreadings. He was not a prophet to be obeyed. He was not a devil to be shunned. He was, at his best, a coach for the soul that is sick of lying. Today you can buy a mug with his face on it and read him on your phone while standing in line with 100 other people staring into tiny black mirrors. It would amuse him. It would also worry him. He would ask whether your solitude makes you more sincere or more strategic, whether your time alone is a shelter for courage or a bunker for bitterness. He would push you gently, and then not gently, toward a question. What could you affirm without apology? if no one was watching. Because here is the emotional gravity of his gamble. To be alone well is to grieve what must be lost. The loss of childish gods, the loss of automatic worth, the loss of a crowd to blame, the loss of that particular sweetness that comes from belonging so hard you forget your shape. It hurts as much as any love affair ending. But in the open space left behind, you can build a table that seats the future version of you without embarrassment. You can invite your past self and forgive them without lying. You can look at the ordinary, your coffee cup, your shoes, the sun making a lozenge of light on the floor, and feel the animal joy of being a creature who wakes up and tries again. It is a simple feeling. It is also a diamond that costs more than most spend on a life. I consent to be alive. I will not trade it for a story that lets me stay asleep. Imagine the mountain path again. The town below is becoming a concept. People who love you and people who don't. Offices where the air smells like paper. Passwords you have to reset. Up here, the only password is, do you mean it? Nietzsche learned, slowly and then all at once, that meaning it requires solitude like a muscle requires resistance. Not the solitude of retreat, but the solitude of consent. The solitude where you ask the demon to tell you the worst and then decide whether you still want to dance. He left us an image of a tightrope stretched over an abyss. On one side, the animal comfort of ancestry, instincts that want what they have always wanted, appetites that could be satisfied forever and never make a life. On the other side, the creator who invents duties for themselves, not to show off, not to advertise a virtue, but to build a form that can endure their own scrutiny. Most people look down and freeze. A few walk. Nietzsche fell. He also taught others to step. To live his insight, you do not need to climb the Alps or resign your job or break with a genius. You need to choose a room where you can be honest with yourself. You need to protect time the way you would protect a person you love. You need to let silence do the hardest work of all, carrying your attention until it is strong enough not to be snatched by every passing show. You need to forgive yourself for your first answers. They will be small. They will be cowardly. You will want to make a speech about why your cowardice is practical. Do not. Admit it. Then try again. The effort is ugly before it is beautiful, like muscles rebuilding, like a garden in winter. Nietzsche did not want disciples. He wanted readers who would put down his books and hear their own thoughts more clearly. He wanted people who would build their own tables rather than eat forever at his. You can tell you've understood him when his sentences stop sounding like weapons and start sounding like weights you use to get stronger. You can tell you've misunderstood him when you use him to justify contempt. He said, "Become who you are," and the tense is the lesson. It takes time. It will hurt. The person you become will occasionally arrest you as a stranger, and you will have to choose whether to welcome them or prosecute them. If you are afraid of becoming hard, you are right to be cautious. An unkind solitude makes tyrants of the timid, but a rigorous solitude is a school for gentleness. Only someone who has faced their own pettiness without excuse can be playful without cruelty. Only someone who has felt the shaking of their own convictions can truly listen. Only someone who has said yes to their life in its stained totality can meet another person without needing to rearrange them. And if you are afraid of becoming soft, you are right to be vigilant. A sentimental togetherness will sell your future for the short warmth of applause. It will replace judgment with slogans and responsibility with roles. It will turn your anger into gossip. It will leave you lonely in a crowd. Nietzsche's cure is not withdrawal. It is engagement without surrender. When you rejoin the city, do it as someone who knows why you are there and what you will not trade. The herd has its uses: language, bread, maps. But to herd yourself because you are afraid is to live without ever tasting your own mouth. There is a question prowling in Nietzsche's pages that refuses to resolve. It sits down next to you when the house is finally quiet and the sky over the city is a salt stain of light. Would you accept your life again? If no, what must change? Not the world, not yet. You. The smallest unit of freedom is a decision made while no one watches. The largest unit is a world built by enough such decisions that the old structures suffocate. You will never control the second. You always have the first. Start there. Start small. Then go for a walk without your defenses. See what the ground says back. If you go too far into yourself without windows, you risk the collapse Nietzsche suffered. If you refuse to enter at all, you risk a life so leashed to others that you die with your bark still in your throat. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow, he wrote, and the why is not a sentence someone hands you. It is the rhythm you find while moving through your days like a person who lives there. The dangerous freedom of being alone is not a lifestyle. It is a vow. I will not betray my life with borrowed despair. I will take the risk of inventing myself. I will bear the responsibility if I fail. Go to your desk and open the window. Take whatever book you've been using to avoid your own questions and put it down. Pour a glass of water. Ask the demon to visit. If it does, do not argue. Listen, the next step is yours alone. If terror appears, remember that courage is not the absence of it, but the agreement to keep moving. If joy appears, be suspicious of the kind that needs an audience. Prefer the kind that makes you forget to tell anyone. There is a bench somewhere, overlooking water, where a thin man once stood smiling at a sentence only he could hear. He is not a saint. He is not a villain. He is a brother in the hardest craft, the art of not lying to oneself. He would tell you, if he could still speak without being misquoted, that your solitude is not a punishment and not a prize. It is a tool. Use it to cut away what is dead. Use it to carve a face you can meet in the mirror without flinching. Use it to learn to laugh out loud, alone, without cruelty, because you have survived yourself and found the world beautiful again. If this opened your eyes, subscribe to Boring History, because the truth is never boring.